Well, hello and good evening, everybody, and welcome to Parks Lake Water Wednesdays. Tonight we have with us Jeri Geiger with the Ministry of Environment, who will talk about aquatic invasive species in Saskatchewan. Tonight's presentation will be recorded and will be placed on Parks YouTube channel following the webinar. So that and along with all the other webinars are there. So if you happen to miss one or want to rewatch one, they'll be there. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, simply type them in the box and we'll go through them at the end of the webinar. Or you can raise your hand at the end of the webinar and we'll turn the mic over to you and you can ask Jeri yourself. Just a reminder that next week we have Joe Josa talking about planning in your lake community with water in mind. And so if you haven't registered for that or the last session, please do so. So before Jeri begins, I'd like to introduce you to Lynn Sass. Lynn is the coordinator for member services with Parks and would like to introduce Jeri and say a few words.
Thanks, Chuck. Hello, everybody. Yes, this is our third session out of 5 sessions of Lake Water Wednesdays. And I do these introductions in 2 parts. The first part that I do is I introduce the lakes to you. And I do that because I want to emphasize how we came to be in charge of these lakes. So first I would start by introducing you to some of the lakes in the southeast, the Capel chain that we all know, Last Mountain Long Lake and several others. These lakes came to be ours to look after under the provisions of Treaty 4 in 1874, when Canada was just still only a very young country. And 2 years later, the water in the southwest became part of the Treaty 6 that was signed. And the biggest water body there was the river, the South Saskatchewan River, which ultimately became a 225 long kilometer lake, Diefenbaker, as well as Blackstrap Lake, and all the other little water bodies down there. And that was Treaty 6 in 1876, again, given to us by First Nations in a signed agreement with the understanding that we would do due diligence and be good caretakers of the waters. And finally, in 1906, 1 year after we became a province, the province signed Treaty 10, which runs across the top half of the agricultural part of Saskatchewan, I would say. And so there's about 20 lakes at least up in that whole area. They start in the west with Turtle Lake, then go over to Candle Lake, and all the lakes up in the northwest and northeast. And that Treaty 10 was where we came to take on those lakes. And I say we, being the province of Saskatchewan now, and it behooves us to remember that we took them on as a sacred obligation from the original owners. And now I turn to Jeri and introduce her to you. Now, when I first met Jeri, just before I met her, working with Parks, we had written a policy, and the policy, if you could all read it here, is aim to stab. That's kind of a smart aleck term. Aim meaning aquatic invasive mussels, and stab meaning stop them at the border. And in this policy, we talked about what was done in other parts of the world, how these mussels had come to be, and we called upon the province to hire someone. And I note in here that in March of 2015, we said, Parks has asked the minister to allocate a trained staff person to assume leadership for preventing contamination of our lakes. And the minister replied, well, we bought a new decontamination unit and started Aquatic Invasive Mussels Week. But that wasn't what we wanted. We wanted a leader. And then a little later on, I see our then president, Sherry Jimmy, said, education alone will not prevent the spread of these mussels into our lakes. It's time for our government to consider an ounce of prevention in the form of border inspection. And that time, the answer from the minister, this time he talked about 2 new decontamination units. I wanted to tell him that if you want to use decontaminations, first you have to find the mussels, but I didn't get a chance to do that. But in this letter, the minister said they had plans to explore options for boat inspection training for border officers. And so we knew that it was in the books and it was coming, and it eventually did come in the form of Jeri Geiger, who was hired, and she has a background as a conservation officer, and she was one of the 15 who went to Minnesota and took training there where they'd had so much experience. And I know that today Jeri isn't going to just talk about aquatic invasive mussels, but it was through the mussels that and the lobbying that Parks was doing that I became very interested, and then got to meet Jeri and sit on her as one of the many on her committee, her reference committee. So I'm just so pleased she could be here. Welcome, Jeri.
Thanks, Lynn. I'm really happy to be here today to have the opportunity to speak to you all about something I know that you guys are very passionate about. And I will definitely speak about invasive mussels because they are sort of the rock star of the aquatic invasive species world. But I also want to touch a little bit on, you know, some of the other things we're doing, some of the other species that are on our radar and that we're actively, you know, working on, and some of the, you know, I guess rationalization behind some of the decisions we make around how we run both the watercraft inspection program, the monitoring program, etc. So I'm going to give it my best shot to give you guys a you know, comprehensive kind of overview of our aquatic invasive species program. And then I'll be happy to field any questions at the end or throughout the presentation if you have any. So I'm going to pop my video off for the duration of my presentation, but I'll pop back on when we do the question period at the end. So, okay, so aquatic invasive species prevention in Saskatchewan. Well, let's make sure that my computer is working here. There we go. Okay, so I'm sure if you're on this presentation and this webinar, you probably do know what aquatic invasive species are, but just in case, and I probably will refer to them as AIS frequently because aquatic invasive species becomes quite a mouthful when you use it several times through the presentation. But aquatic invasive species are really an organism that have the ability to have a negative impact on the ecology, or, you know, have a negative economic impact, socioeconomic impact in a new location. So they're non-native, and if introduced to a new location, they have the ability to have negative impacts. And so why does this matter? Well, when it comes to aquatic invasive species, you know, when we talk about the health of an ecosystem, biodiversity is really one of the key measures that we use to measure the health of a system. And aquatic invasive species negatively impact biodiversity. And for you folks here, you know, you're all cottage owners or have, you know, part of a recreational community. AIS have definite negative impacts as far as property values go. You know, they can decrease property values, and they will also reduce the areas you have for recreation. So this might be, you know, your beaches, that now beaches are not usable, or you have an increase of aquatic plants that just make an area no longer suitable for swimming or boating. So when we talk about, you know, the economic and socioeconomic impacts, those are where we see some of those negative impacts. They affect the food availability for native species. So they decrease the amount of food that's available in a system, and they can reduce habitat quality. So, you know, when we're looking at particularly species at risk, you know, or species that don't have a lot of great habitat left, you know, an introduction of an invasive species can negatively affect that habitat quality. And so on the other side of things, aquatic invasive species increase the competition for native species, both with food, as I said, habitat, So we have habitat loss. And when it comes to our utilities, this is something that, money talks. Aquatic invasive species, such as invasive mussels in particular, really negatively impact the province in the sense that, when they impact infrastructure and they're clogging intake pipes for water treatment or wastewater or hydro facilities, those costs will probably get pushed back onto the user. And so as residents of Saskatchewan, our utility costs are going to increase. And as I said, there is a direct link between introductions of AIS to native species and species at risk as well. And we do have a number of species at risk here in the prairies that are at risk if we have an introduction of aquatic invasive species. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the background and just sort of how we manage aquatic invasive species, not just in Saskatchewan, but in Canada. So, obviously aquatic invasive species don't care about provincial borders or international borders. And here in the province, we don't have jurisdiction over the international border. So for that reason, here in Saskatchewan, we have provincial regulations regulating aquatic invasive species, but Canada also has federal aquatic invasive species regulations under the Federal Fisheries Act, so that we can address some of those things like protection across the international border and movement between provinces within the country. So as I said, there's a Federal Fisheries Act, and under that is the aquatic invasive species regulations on the federal side. And it really is just to help bridge those gaps, especially between provincial pieces of legislation. And then the AIS regulations really aim to address local AIS issues and provide that national framework for managing and controlling AIS in Canada, just to have somewhat of a consistent framework as far as how aquatic invasive species are managed across the country. And so while the federal government is the lead for AIS in some provinces and territories, so particularly out on the East Coast, they will be the lead, and in territories like Yukon and Northwest Territories, they are the lead jurisdiction. But across the prairies and here in Saskatchewan, we have the designated authority for the management of fisheries within the province. And this includes aquatic invasive species. So that's why provincially here in Saskatchewan, it's the province that manages aquatic invasive species and is responsible for prevention into Saskatchewan. Our regulations provincially that manage aquatic invasive species are the Fisheries Act, Saskatchewan, and the fisheries regulations. So those are two pieces of key legislation. And under the fisheries regulations, this is where you'll find our prohibited list. So these are kind of our wanted list of species. These are what is regulated within the province. And you'll certainly see some species you're familiar with. I'm sure you've heard of northern snakehead, many of the Asian carp species, zebra, quagga mussels, but there are also a number of species on here that are maybe a little bit less familiar to you, including things like spiny water flea, small invertebrates, snails, New Zealand mud snail, channeled apple snail. So it's kind of a mixed bag. We have some species that are aquarium species. It kind of ranges. When it comes to aquatic plants, they are actually regulated under the Weed Control Act. So this is a piece of agriculture's legislation, so the Ministry of Ag. However, we are looking to move these aquatic plant species into the fisheries regulations as well, just to be able to expand our ability to manage and control those species. So just to kind of increase our ability and our options when it comes to management, prevention, and control, etc. So there are 4 aquatic plants that are considered prohibited, and we do have these in a number of neighboring jurisdictions. So they are definitely right on our doorstep, and something we are concerned about. So everybody, of course, knows about zebra and quagga mussels. As I said, they're kind of the rock stars, and these invasive mussels are pretty distinct once you've had a chance to see one. They look very different from our native mussels. They're very triangular in shape. Our native mussels tend to be much more round and don't have that pointed side. They're quite small. They can range, from microscopic in size up to 2 inches. Typically, we don't see them that big. We're often seeing them in the, couple of millimeter range, but they can get up to about 2 inches. quagga mussels tend to be bigger and they're a little bit more rounded than zebra mussels, but again, not nearly as round as our native species. And one of the major concerns with zebra and quagga mussels is actually the larvae, or we call them veligers. And the issue with invasive mussel larvae is that they're microscopic, and so they're free floating in the water column. They just float around. They're hanging out in the water. And so when I talk a little bit later about, you know, pathways of movement and watercraft movement, this is why we are concerned about the movement of water, because anything that can hold water that has been in the water has the potential to pick up these larvae and these veligers and transport them to other water bodies. And it doesn't take a lot of moisture or water to keep them alive. As long as there's enough humidity and moisture there, they can actually survive out of water for a decent amount of time. So they're quite tough little guys. And as I said, you know, they'll spread by attaching to boats, plants, and other objects. They're really good little hitchhikers. They'll spread downstream. So, you know, when we talk later about, you know, management plans and response, you know, of course, they flow with water. So if we have an introduction in one location and it's a flowing system, you know, there's a very good chance that the rest of the downstream of that system will also eventually be contaminated. So, you know, prevention is key here. The invasive mussels are filter feeders. So I mentioned, you know, as I said, they just remove the food for native species, and they'll clean up the water really nicely. The water will be beautiful and clear and look really great. But really what that means is that there's no nutrients in the water. You've now changed the habitat, you've changed the ecology of the system. And now native species who rely on the, you know, the phytoplankton that was in the water prior to the introduction of zebra mussels for food, that's no longer there. So they just very quickly outcompete any native species. And as I said, they can filter up to 1 liter of water per day, just one little zebra mussel. So here's just an example. This is much more typical of the size that we see, you know, when we're talking about watercraft inspection, and you think of a large vessel like a sailboat or a houseboat or a cabin cruiser, and you look at the size of these zebra mussels, and I said this is really probably the most common size that we've run into. You can understand or kind of appreciate the challenge of trying to find these tiny little zebra mussels in nooks and crannies on a vessel as large as, you know, a houseboat or you know, just any kind of watercraft. They're very, very small. This is a photo from Lake Winnipeg, actually. So Cindy Sawchuk, she is the canine handler for the program in Alberta. So Alberta has 3 aquatic invasive species canines, and they were out in Winnipeg last summer doing some training. And this is a photo that they took on one of the beaches there. So when I talk about, you know, loss of recreational area or usable area for recreation, this is a perfect example of the dead shells that wash up. And it just shows you the scale of, you know, of the introduction and the established population of zebra mussels in Lake Winnipeg. And you can see on her rubber boots there how thick those shells are. I think now in Lake Winnipeg, they've actually purchased commercial harvesters who have to come along the beaches and sweep up these shells. And I think they're looking for ways to use them. I'm not sure if they found one, but it really creates a real mess and can have significant impacts for any of our recreational areas. And for a province like Saskatchewan, when, you know, tourism is such a huge part of our culture in Saskatchewan and has been a part of everybody's life for so long, you know, to lose those recreational areas would be devastating. So I'm going to shift away from invasive mussels for a minute and talk about a couple of the other species that we're actively working on. And if you haven't heard of Prussian carp, I'll tell you a little bit about them here. So they're from Europe, and they look very similar to a goldfish. And they're actually a species that's able to clone themselves. So it's believed that Prussian carp escaped from an aquaculture shipment in Alberta, and they've come down through the watershed into Lake Diefenbaker and the Swift Current area. And they definitely are in Lake Diefenbaker and kind of the Annerley Lake chain. And We aren't seeing the same impacts in Saskatchewan that Alberta is seeing when it comes to Prussian carp. Typically, you know, in shallow systems, they'll very quickly become the dominant species in a shallow system. But Diefenbaker is obviously a very deep, large lake, and there's much more, you know, there's a ton of predators in the lake that I think will help control the population. But really what we want to do is find out more about this species and why we're not seeing the same impacts that Alberta is seeing. So we're currently funding some research at the University of Regina on Prussian carp. So they're doing some diet analysis, they're looking into breeding areas and just trying to better understand you know, the species and how they're using the lake at Diefenbaker. And what we're hoping to do is be able to use this information to develop a bit of a management plan, because we know that they are here. You know, and thankfully they are not in the Qu'Appelle system at this time, but we definitely are concerned that if they were ever to get into the Qu'Appelle system, they could wreak havoc there because it's a much more shallow system compared to, say, Diefenbaker. We're currently partnering with the Invasive Species Centre in Ontario on the development of a socioeconomic risk assessment for Prussian carp across the prairies. And this is a collaboration really between Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, who are all equally concerned about Prussian carp. You know, they haven't made it to Manitoba yet, but if they do, you know, that's one more problem that Manitoba has to deal with when they're currently already trying to deal with a good population of zebra mussels. So we're trying to work on, you know, just understanding the species a little bit better so that we all have a better idea of how to move forward and manage the species in the prairies. Flowering rush is another a prohibited species that is actually already here in Saskatchewan. If you weren't aware, flowering rush is, it was initially, well, it is still sold in some jurisdictions. It's not prohibited. So it's sold as a landscaping plant, a water garden plant. It's really quite pretty. And it looks very similar to our native rushes, aside from the big bulb of pink flowers on top. So it is really a pretty plant when it's in bloom, but it very quickly can become a monoculture wherever it's placed. So it's believed that flowering rush came from the Calgary Zoo, actually. So when the Calgary or the Bow River flooded in 2000 and was it 2010, 2011, it's believed that just the floodwaters removed the plants from one of the exhibits at the Calgary Zoo and carried it into the South Saskatchewan River, and it's been making its way down the South Saskatchewan River ever since. So for a few years now, we've been partnering with the South Saskatchewan River Watershed Stewards and the Invasive Species Council on monitoring the species, just to kind of determine how far down the river it's come and assess it every year, and then to work on removal whenever possible. So just trying to keep a handle on it and minimize the spread as much as possible. We have another population of flowering rush over on the east side of the province near Esterhazy, near Cutarm Creek. And we're working with Mosaic to assess and potentially remove the population out there this year. We have recently been approved, or the use of a herbicide that is very effective in the control of flowering rush was recently approved, and so we have some more tools at our disposal now to be able to actually actively try to remove and eradicate these populations. Fortunately, the population over by Cutarm Creek isn't in as much of a fast flowing system like the South Saskatchewan River, so we feel fairly confident that we'll be able to tackle the population over at Esterhazy. So that's something we're working on over the next couple of years. Invasive crayfish. So we don't have any reports of invasive crayfish in the environment in Saskatchewan, but there are a number of species, or 2 species specifically, that are on our prohibited list. And so the rusty crayfish is currently in Manitoba. It's in Ontario, and it's believed that that introduction was the result of an angler discarding used bait. So, brought and used crayfish as bait, had to go, didn't end up using all of his bait, and dumped the crayfish out into the water. And now rusty crayfish is quite prevalent in southern Ontario and into Manitoba. Rusty crayfish is quite a bit larger than our native species of crayfish, and much, much more aggressive. And it is really, it tends to shred the vegetation in a water body. So when we talk about habitat destruction and habitat loss, it can really wreak havoc on habitat for native species. The marbled crayfish is actually an aquarium species. And unfortunately, it's often sold under, it's misidentified and sold as another species, most often the electric blue crayfish. And this is another one of those species that has the ability to clone itself. So, somebody goes in and buys a crayfish for their aquarium tank, you buy one crayfish, and several months down the road, you now have 20 crayfish, and you don't know what to do with them. And we never want people to release aquarium species into the environment, but unfortunately it does happen. And the concern with this species is just its ability to reproduce asexually and really, explode in population. So the marbled crayfish was a fairly recent addition to our prohibited list. And new last year, we implemented a new regulation that prohibited the collection of crayfish from Saskatchewan waters, as well as the possession and use of crayfish for bait. So it can no longer be used for consumption. It can't be used for educational purposes aside from having a scientific permit, and it can't be used for bait. And really, this was to address the potential for an introduction of invasive crayfish, but also to prevent the movement of native crayfish into other water bodies within the province. And I think that that's something that people don't think about as often, is that, we want, if something is in a particular water body, whether it be a plant, an invertebrate, a fish, whatever it may be, we want it to stay in that system. And we do not want it to be moved to any other watersheds or systems, even within the province, right? So the idea is just don't move things in general. And so this prohibition around crayfish was really to kind of tackle, as I said, the potential introduction of new invasive crayfish, but also to prevent movement around the province. Spiny water flea it really just looks like a gelatinous blob of goo. And it's a small invertebrate that eats zooplankton. And, as you can see from its name, the spiny water flea, it has those large spines, and it's a protection for the water flea. And native fish, waterfowl, they're not interested in eating this zooplankton this invertebrate, and those spines will get caught in its throat. And so without natural predators, the population can really explode as well. And this is something that is in Manitoba as well, so it's right on our doorstep. And we don't fully understand the impacts that it will have on our fishery at this time, but we're keeping a very close eye on it. And actually new for this year, we've developed some new outreach material to target spiny water flea. And what we want to encourage is to have anglers make sure that they're checking their gear, particularly if you're leaving the province, but really, your angling gear and your equipment should be checked, cleaned, drained, dried, just like your watercraft should be, because, there are species that, maybe this won't attach to a boat, but it's going to hitchhike on your angling gear. So, we're trying to open people's minds a little bit and get them to kind of look at, like I said, pathways or vectors. And I'll get to that a little bit in a minute, but instead of focusing on a particular species, because if we can get them to follow those best management practices, it's really effective at preventing the spread of a number of different invasive species. So as I said, I've talked a little bit about pathways, and pathway examples are really just means of movement or means of introduction. So some examples here, I talked about live release from aquariums, water gardens. We never encourage the release of live organisms. Bait, as I mentioned, the crayfish, it's a big one. International shipping and the movement of water in ballast tanks and those large international shipping vessels is how they suspect that we received invasive mussels in the first place. So a large vessel was over in the Mediterranean, came across into the Great Lakes, purged that ballast water, and with it belligers from invasive mussels, leading to an introduction. And it's just spread across North America from there. E-commerce and the online trade of plants and organisms is, I wouldn't say it's a new pathway, but it's certainly one that is exploding in the sense that it is so easy to get anything online, you know, it's just a click away. And, you know, the trade of organisms and plants is no different than the trade of any other goods. And the sheer volume of, you know, materials and objects and parcels and packages that cross those international borders and provincial borders, and, you know, on a daily basis, the scope is so enormous that it's a really, really difficult thing to try and get a handle on. And this really came to light when we were dealing with, you know, the contaminated mossballs that we had this year that triggered our response plan. And, you know, the availability of those products online really created some serious challenges. Intentional release, I would say this is something that is not as common, but certainly does happen. And, you know, there's colleagues in the East, in Nova Scotia, that have a good example of this, where, you know, you have an area, a small little lake that you really like to fish, and it's great bass habitat. So you know what, why don't we just throw a couple of bass in there? You know, there's a bass lake down the road. I'll throw a few in my bucket and release them into this lake because I want more fishing opportunities. It's just, you know, what's the harm? Well, the harm is that, you know, now you have a species that was not there that can become established, and in this particular example is threatening some pretty sensitive and at-risk salmon stocks out on the East Coast. So, you know, it can have some really serious impacts, but again, maybe not as common, but certainly does happen. And then, of course, here in Saskatchewan, I would say this is one of our biggest ones. We're concerned about the overland transport of watercraft and recreational equipment. So you may have seen this this slide or this graph before, but what we call it is the invasion curve. And really what I wanted to show you was just so that you have an idea, or you can see a visual of how the cost of control and kind of the area of infestation increases over time once you've passed that introduction point. And you have a very small window for eradication, if eradication is possible at all. One of the challenges in aquatic invasive species management is the lack of tools and lack of resources for eradication. But if you do have the opportunity for eradication, it's typically a very short window. And likewise for containment as well, you have a very, you know, short time frame where you might actually be successful at containing that species. And then once you've reached that point, past that containment point, you're really looking at long-term management, and the costs associated with that and the area of infestation just increase exponentially as time progresses. And so when it comes to our program and how we manage aquatic invasive species, we operate under 4 program pillars: prevention, early detection, response, management, and control. And this is really a framework that's pretty consistent. Well, I shouldn't say pretty, it's very consistent across Canada and the US as well. So under prevention, obviously legislation is a big piece of that. So in order for us to have a watercraft inspection program, we had to lay the foundation to allow us to do that. And so there were a number of pieces of legislation that were modified to allow us to, you know, have additional authorities for watercraft inspection, to make it mandatory for boaters to stop at inspection stations. So, you know, this is not a voluntary process. This is something that is mandatory, because without those regulations in place, you know, we really didn't have the foundation to be able to run a watercraft inspection program. So as I said, here in Saskatchewan, and likewise across the prairies in Western Canada, inspections at all watercraft inspection stations are mandatory. So any person that is moving a watercraft, if you encounter a watercraft inspection station in your travels, you must stop. Whether you've been inspected 2 hours ago in Winnipeg, it doesn't matter. You must stop at every inspection station that you encounter along your route. And I'll explain why in a few minutes here. This is a very wordy slide, but really what I want you to take away from it is at the beginning, when I showed you that list of prohibited species, what the regulations state is that you cannot do any of these things with those prohibited species. So you cannot import them into the province, you cannot buy or sell, you cannot attempt to buy or sell, you cannot possess them, dead or alive, that is important as well. You can't transport them, and you can't introduce or dispose of any of those prohibited species in Saskatchewan waters. And so this is where we as officers, so whether that be conservation officers or fisheries officers, we have the authorities to be able to make sure that, you know, all of these things do not happen for those prohibited species under our regulations. We also have a list of what we call high-risk jurisdictions, and this is important when it comes to watercraft inspection because it helps us kind of triage watercraft when it comes to, you know, whether they're going to need a decontamination or just a thorough inspection. And this comes into play as well at the international border with our partnership with Canada Border Service Agency. So if a boat has been in what we call a high-risk jurisdiction within the last 30 days, it's instantly determined to be a high-risk watercraft. And that's because of the ability for many of these species to live out of the water for, you know, 5+ days. And we use that 30 days as sort of just to give that extra cushion. And so anything that's been in those high-risk jurisdictions within 30 days, a conservation officer, a Canada Border Service agent, fisheries officer, they have the ability to inspect the watercraft, and not just the watercraft, but the trailer, the vehicle that's hauling the watercraft, as well as the place or thing. And I touched a little bit about mothballs and the contaminated mothballs that we had that came into Saskatchewan, and this was important with that response because that place or thing clause allowed us to be able to go into the aquarium stores and to inspect their aquariums to see if they had mothball products that could potentially be contaminated with invasive mussels. So the language within the regulations is really important when we're looking at, you know, authorities for what we can or cannot do. And so, as I said, we wanted to make sure that our officers had the ability to inspect, clean, quarantine watercraft or vehicles or equipment if need be, if we find anything that is fouled with aquatic invasive species. And that quarantine piece is really important as well because it provides that additional cushion over and above the decontamination. So if a watercraft comes to us and we do an inspection and we find it to be fouled with aquatic invasive species, our staff will perform a decontamination. They will remove the aquatic invasive species. They'll do that first, then they will decontaminate the watercraft, and they'll quarantine the watercraft for 30 days as a standard practice. After that, they'll re-inspect the watercraft, and if need be, we'll follow up with a second decontamination, but typically it's just the decontamination in the quarantine period. So another important piece of prevention is, of course, education and outreach. And we do a lot of different, we try a lot of different methods and to connect with folks in a number of ways and to target various users, right? It's not always anglers. We need to think about sailboat, sailing clubs and anglers and, you know, kayakers, and it just all of any user of the water essentially. So it's not just anglers. And so we've really tried to broaden our audience and to use a number of different methods to try and connect with folks. So as I said, we've got messages in the Angler's Guide. We use social media a lot. We have information on our website. We partner with the Provincial Parks. So entry gate staff will ask questions as folks are coming into the park around, you know, what is your knowledge on aquatic invasive species, and then provide additional, you know, pamphlets or to help educate them on the risks of aquatic invasive species. And then, of course, clean, drain, dry. And this is a message you have probably heard 1,000 times and will hear 1,000 more. But as I said, that clean, drain, dry piece is so important. And it's a standard message across Canada. It's, you know, it's understood that those three acts are really effective at preventing the spread of a number of different aquatic invasive species. So our own aquatic invasive species watercraft inspectors, our staffs go out and talk locally with boaters. You know, every interaction with a boater for us is an opportunity to educate folks on clean, drain, dry and best management practices and what they can do to prevent the spread and introduction of invasive species. Lynn kind of briefly mentioned in my introduction the Aquatic Invasive Species Task Force. So this is a provincial task force that has a number of stakeholders sitting on it, including parks. And it's a number of government ministries, it's a number of crown corporations, agencies, NGOs. It's really what we were looking for is a comprehensive group of folks who have kind of a vested interest and you know, a stake, skin in the game when it comes to you know, what would happen if we had an introduction of AIS. And so those task force partners help us with a number of things. But one of the big ones that they are sort of responsible for is to share that clean, drain, dry message, and to educate folks within their networks as well. So that allows us to kind of amplify our voice provincially across and through the networks of our partners. So here's an example of just some of the types of messages we're trying to get out. You know, pull the plug on invasive species. The removal of the drain plug for transport is so important that if we have an introduction, if people are already following those best management practices, we are miles ahead at preventing any additional spread within the province. But until we get those local folks to buy into that piece, you know, we are at continued risk of just an amplified spread if we have an introduction. So, you know, trying to get folks, it's sort of an out of sight, out of mind type thing for some local residents, I think, and we're really trying to push past that. You know, we encourage folks, are you purchasing a boat out of province? Contact our program. We will do an inspection for you. It's free of charge. We try to be as accessible and available and accommodating as possible for anybody who needs an inspection, because we understand that, you know, it's in our best interests for people to take the initiative to contact us as well. As I mentioned, stop the spread of spiny water flea. This is something that's new for this year, and we're really trying to, as I said, get folks to take a step back and start thinking about all aquatic invasive species and not necessarily focusing on just invasive mussels. The economic and socioeconomic impacts of invasive mussels are enormous, and there's no denying that. So I certainly understand why they tend to get, you know, the majority of the attention and the funding, really. But there are certainly a number of other species that can have some pretty significant impacts, and so we're trying to look at those, take, you know, that pathway approach, and look at vectors and ways that we can address a number of species at once. So as I said, our watercraft inspection program it's certainly not the be-all end-all of AIS prevention, but for us it's a big part of the puzzle. And so why do we inspect boats? Well, obviously we want to educate boaters. We want to complete those watercraft inspections and decontaminations and eliminate the risk if we encounter high-risk watercraft. So in 2015, regulations allowed or were strengthened to give conservation officers and fisheries officers the ability to inspect those watercraft and related equipment. As I said, just kind of laying the foundation for the development of the watercraft inspection program. So we have a risk-based watercraft inspection strategy. Well, what does that mean? What that means is that we take a step back, we collect information with every interaction we have with boaters to be able to identify high-risk routes of travel. You know, we can identify dates of when we tend to have the highest flow of high-risk traffic. It really just helps us focus our resources and allocate our resources as best as we can, because we are operating, you know, we're challenged with minimal capacity, I will say. So currently we have 11 watercraft inspectors, and just for some perspective, in 2018 we had 2 watercraft inspectors. So we've grown significantly in a few years here. We have 5 inspection stations, and we have additional decontamination units in key locations in the province, and one of them is at Tobin Lake, just because Tobin Lake is such a destination for international fishermen, especially, and Manitoba fishermen, and so it just provides us an extra layer of protection. And we work very closely with the conservation officers there, who are trained to use the unit, and they will help us out as well if we aren't able to get staff there. We partner with Canada Border Service Agency. As I said, we monitor all of the traffic that's coming through the international border from the US. Obviously, you know, this last year, and who knows what's going to happen this year, was a bit of a strange one for us with that border closed. We certainly aren't seeing the volume of traffic that we usually see, but we have a really good partnership with CBSA, and they are very supportive of our program, and they forward all notifications. Any high-risk boat that comes to the border is triaged, as I said, using that a set criteria that they receive from us. They receive training from us, and they will triage those boats, and anything that needs follow-up inspection or has a risk of potentially carrying AIS is forwarded to our provincial staff. So they'll receive an additional thorough inspection and decontamination if needed. So boats are sealed at the border if they're high risk, and we're contacted immediately. And it's been working very well. We also collaborate really closely with other Western provinces, and we have an MOU with the Western provinces that covers everything from coordination for watercraft inspection, watercraft inspection hours. We notify each other about the movement of high-risk watercraft or anything that's mussel fouled, because often we'll see large vessels like sailboats moving from Ontario to BC. Well, they're crossing a number of jurisdictions, and we kind of keep each other in the know and follow the transportation of that watercraft until it gets to its destination, and it's either quarantined at the other end and it's inspected and decontaminated as needed. So there's a ton of coordination that happens both at the provincial level and with the federal government as well. So as far as our inspection station locations, I wanted to throw this on there just to give you guys a visual if you weren't aware of where we put our stations. So the blue stations are fixed. They're there all of the time. They don't move. And of course, there's nothing showing on the southern border, but every single Saskatchewan port of entry, CBSA port of entry, basically would be a star. Because, as I said, any boat that comes through any of those ports of entry is triaged and forwarded to us for follow-up. And that's part of the reason why we have those stations in Regina and Swift Current. So they are responsive. They're roving stations, and they respond to anything coming through the southern international border. And then they also work the local lakes, so in and around the Qu'Appelle chain, Buffalo Pound, Sask Landing, those areas as well, to try and educate local boaters. So when I talked about pathways and some of the information that we collect to take a risk-based approach, this is sort of the way we've identified some of those high-risk crossings and high-risk locations, and helped us determine where we were going to allocate those resources. Last year, we actually had a temporary station up on Highway 3 as well, near Hudson Bay, and it was actually quite slow. Obviously, last year was a bit of a strange year, but it was a slow year, so we chose to move that station back down south in the event that the border does open up this year. So this is a bit of a crazy slide, but what I wanted to show you is the type of information that we are collecting from boaters. So this graph shows the last visited water body to the destination lake in Saskatchewan. So the destination is obviously the blue, and the origin is the orange. And this was data from 2019. So this was a year where we're actually getting all of the US traffic as well. And you can see the darker lines are obviously where we have a higher number of boats traveling from those routes. So when I talk about kind of hot spots or high risk routes, this is some of the information that we're using to make those decisions around where we're placing our resources. This next map is a similar idea, but it's actually showing us what fishing region the boaters are going to, and we can do the same thing and filter out by provincial park, for example. So we may be able to say, okay, well, we know we have a ton of boaters coming from, let's say, Montana, and they're going to Buffalo Pound. And we are actually also able to go then and look at our data around, for example, have they had their drain plug removed? And we can identify where in the province we need to focus our efforts. It might be focusing our efforts on education, so maybe additional signage at a provincial park, or more interpretive programs to help educate folks in a particular park. Do we need to work with the conservation officers to do more hands-on inspections at boat launches at a particular park? So we're able to collect a huge amount of information in our surveys when we do a watercraft inspection with boaters during every encounter. So it's really exciting for us to be able to have these visuals, to be able to kind of compile all of that information, and as I said, help us allocate those resources accordingly. So I'm going to go back to the program pillars here again, and I've talked about prevention. Now I'm going to talk about our monitoring. So this map shows where we've monitored in 2020. So we covered 125 waters, 12 major subbasins, and 46 of those were considered high-risk waters. So this means that they have road access. The water chemistry is suitable for the establishment of invasive mussels, for example. So there's a number of criteria that we use to determine whether a water body would be high risk, and then we focus our efforts and our monitoring efforts on those highest risk water bodies, and then we kind of accomplish whatever we can over and above that. We have several partnerships in place for monitoring of invasive mussels and spiny water flea. And as I mentioned, we have those partnerships through our task force. This is another way that some of those partners help us, is through monitoring. And there are a number of groups that are doing monitoring for us over and above our provincial monitoring. We're going into a pilot project this year with DFO, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. We've done eDNA in the past, or environmental DNA. It's quite expensive, so we're looking to do a bit of a pilot to look at the feasibility of trying to incorporate eDNA back into our monitoring. So something we're exploring. It's definitely an interesting tool. It's not foolproof, but just one more tool for early detection. And I think Lynn has spoken to many of you about AIM before, but AIM is our adult invasive mussel monitoring program. And really it's a citizen science program that allows the public to assist with monitoring of invasive mussels. And as I said, early detection, when you think of that invasion curve, when I said there's such a short, narrow window for eradication or containment, early detection is key. And the sooner we find out about or identify that we have a species in a location that it should not be, the sooner we can get in there and attempt to eradicate or control and kind of assess the situation. So it's really critical to prevent further spread as well to any additional lakes within the province, because we have watercraft that moves, all over the province very frequently. And really what AIM is it's you can put out a sampler, or if you live at the lake, which again is part of the resort communities, I'm sure many of you have infrastructure in the water right now, whether it be a boat lift or a dock, just simply inspect your infrastructure. Check it at the beginning of the season, check it at the end of the season. Let us know if you find anything. That presence absence data is just, the absence data is just as important as the presence data. And really all you're looking for is something, if you have immature or young mussels that are starting to attach to a surface, it'll feel a little bit like sandpaper. So if it feels really rough and things are really stuck on there, it's a sign that maybe there might be something there. And with AIM, it's just very easy to report your findings using a free app, or you can do it online as well. And we have substrate samplers available for distribution. So if you're interested in putting a sampler out onto your dock, you can go through Lynn or contact me. We would love to get some of these samplers out into the waters and get additional data and reporting on presence absence of invasive mussels across the province. So these are it's 5 steps. As I said, you don't have to memorize this or write this down, but this is information I can provide to you if you're interested. But I just wanted to show how easy it was, that it's just a few simple steps, and you can have the app installed and you'd be reporting data back to the province. So again, I've kind of covered now our prevention and early detection pillars, and thankfully the province has been in a position where, specifically for invasive mussels at least, we've been able to stay within that prevention and early detection, that part of the program, and we haven't had to worry about response. However, we have been working on a rapid response plan. We recognize that we are fortunate to be able to take, lessons learned and learn from, for example, Manitoba, who was really faced with a huge feat of having to control the movement and spread of zebra mussels, not only within Manitoba to other water bodies within Manitoba, but into Western Canada as well. So you know, we recognized that we needed to work on our response plan, and we have a draft aquatic invasive species rapid response plan. And the plan uses incident command, which is a very common tool used, you know, with forest fires or really any emergency response. And the reason for going to an incident command system is because we have the ability to be consistent with other provinces, neighboring provinces particularly. So all of the prairie provinces have adopted the incident command system into their response plan. And so this kind of just allows us to be operating on the same playing field. We understand the same language, and it will allow us to assist our neighbors as well in the event of a response. So it's been a really interesting exercise to develop the response plan. But thankfully we had it because just this past March, as I said, we had confirmation of zebra mussel contaminated mossballs or aquarium products arrive in Saskatchewan, and they were on shelves in retail stores here in the province. And that incident did trigger our response plan, and we ended up activating or implementing a provincial incident command structure, and we ended up operating as part of a unified incident command with the federal government as well, because in that particular case, we had, you know, a prohibited species crossing provincial borders and moving from province to province, but also crossing international borders. These were products that were being imported from outside of Canada and outside of North America as well. So as I said, you know, at the beginning when I talked about the regulations and acts at the provincial level, but also the federal level, as I said, we needed to bring in the federal government because they have jurisdiction over that international border. So management of aquatic invasive species can get a little bit complicated, and we saw that you know, in the mossball incident, but it was a good test of our response plan, and I think you know, it was a good learning opportunity for us, and we are very confident that we were able to remove those products off the shelf, and we responded very quickly. So it was, as I said, a good learning opportunity. And for us now, we'll be able to go back to our response plan and have the opportunity to, you know, evaluate our response to the mossball incident and kind of look at, identify gaps if there are any, and make those changes if need be. So as I said, we thankfully have been able to stay within the prevention and early detection side of the program, but the response and management control pieces are not out of our mind. As I said, there are sort of things happening in the background that support those two program pillars. So it's a lot of information in a very short time, but I'm hoping that I've been able to provide kind of a good summary overall of our watercraft, or sorry, of our aquatic invasive species program. And with that, I would happily take some questions if there are any, Charles.
Thanks, Jeri. That was excellent. I'm not seeing any questions so far in the chat box. So, I mean, if you would like to type in a question, feel free, or simply raise your hand and ask a question. So I see, Brian, you've got your hand up. So you're
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, so Jeri, a very interesting presentation. I was particularly interested to hear how the organization mobilized to put somebody in place to actually be responsible for the program. And from that, you know, you've developed an entire team and a strategy to manage this journey. So I'm curious to know, you know, how much time went into the actual delivery of the proposals and presentations to the funding organization, and you know, what is your reporting requirements to them, to that funding? Is it just, does it go on, like hypothetically, I say to them, well, we've done it, we've solved the problem, we're no longer needed. So I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek. So clearly there must be, as you're moving forward, you're developing program and you're increasing your team, and that must require some additional budgeting. And I'm just wondering how you go about managing those requirements, you know, and then responding to funding that you get, which might be typically a little less than you asked for.
Yeah, so there's a couple of pieces to that. So we do report biannually to the committee. Fish and Wildlife Development Fund Committee, which is where our funding comes from. And you know, we were pretty lucky those first few years. We haven't seen major changes in our budget. So those first few years we recognized were going to be years of growth, and we took you know, every opportunity to be able to make those capital purchases, and recognizing that in order to grow we had to have the resources to do that. So you know, we've tried to basically purchase all of those big resources that we needed, and the strategies behind how we're going to use them. And now we're looking at having to go back and sort of reassess, you know, when it comes to, for example, response. So now we've developed the response plan, and you know, we recognize what it is going to cost to have a full-blown response, and it's huge. And so we've had to go and you know, we've identified that there are still needs, particularly on the response side. So we are trying to work to increase our capacity. You know, obviously that's always a challenge, but you know, we're doing whatever we can to try and identify that there are still things that I think need to be addressed in order for us to be well positioned to be able to properly respond.
So if you were a betting man, would you sort of suggest that your organization, if you 5 years time, you'd be quite a bit bigger and quite a bit more informed, if you will, or ready to, or managing the journey a little bit better? Is that sort of what you think?
It's so hard to say. I don't own a crystal ball. I would like to say yes, but I also know that it's challenging, especially right now with economic times. I mean, it's difficult for anybody that is trying to get an increased budget to try and operate with what they need. But I think the benefit with the Aquatic Invasive Species Program is that we have a level of coordination with provincial partners, with the federal government, working on kind of huge, like large scale projects. As I said, you know, we have our provincial response plan, but part of that is also a national framework for response, and a national framework for the Western provinces response. So there's various levels of all of those documents, I suppose, that kind of show the need. And so I think the support and the rationale is building, and what we're working towards is being able to kind of lay it out on the table and say, you know, look, if we want to be well positioned, this is what we need. And whether we get that, it's hard to say. I think we've been really well supported to date. We have a lot of support as far as making changes to our legislation. So one thing that I didn't touch on in the presentation is that we are currently working on a review of our fisheries regulations. So the Fisheries Act was reviewed last year. This year we're going through amendments to the fisheries regulations, and as part of that we'll be putting forth a huge proposal for anything related to AIS to really boost you know, our prevention and the scope of our options for preventing AIS, and kind of trying to address some of those gaps through legislation as well. Because when the regulations were first amended for AIS prevention, you know, this program didn't exist, and so it was sort of working to laying the foundation. Well, now we have the program, and now we've been able to, you know, we've had a response, for example, the mossball response, and now we can take a step back and look and say, okay, well, where are the gaps? And it's not always, you know, funding that is going to help you address those gaps. There's other options. And so for us, you know, making those regulatory amendments and those changes to the regulations will really help us kind of bridge some of those gaps without having to get increased funding. I hope that makes sense, and that you kind of understand where I'm coming from on that. But there are many, you know, the regulations are a pretty great tool, and we have a lot of support from the previous minister and the current minister as far as putting some of those regulations in place. So I would say, as you know, compared to other jurisdictions, we're sitting really well, and I think we do really have a lot of support to be able to make those changes.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Brian, for that question. Sandy, you had your hand up. Did you have a question?
Yes. Jerry, I had heard a few years ago that Montana had a few reservoirs that had been discovered to be hosting zebra mussels and quagga mussels. Have you heard any results as to whether they've been able to contain them just to those reservoirs or eliminate them from there?
I believe they've had one additional water body, but they've done fairly well. It's still considered a high-risk jurisdiction for our purposes. You know, we don't operate our program on a water body, like a lake-by-lake basis. So for example, if one reservoir has it and you've come from reservoir 200 kilometers down the road, you're not considered high risk. We go by jurisdiction just to make sure that we're kind of capturing everything. And because it does take some time for things to show up in monitoring, we want to make sure that we're being as cautious as we can. So I think they've been able to contain things fairly well, considering, you know, they get a lot of traffic in and out of those reservoirs, but I think that they've had a little bit of spread.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much there, Sandy. I've got a question here. What can be done if mussels are found in a lake? Is it feasible to eradicate mussels once they're in a sizable lake?
Ooh, that's a tough question. It's complicated. So part of the challenge is that there aren't a lot of management tools. So potash obviously is shown to be very effective against invasive mussels. But a couple of things. So potash, while not regulated for you know, as for its regular use, when you're using it as a pesticide, if you're using it to kill something, which we would be using it to kill invasive mussels, it changes it from just a product to a pesticide. And so with that, you now trigger the pesticide management regulatory process, and approvals need to be in place to be able to use it for that purpose. So currently, it's actually Alberta that's leading the charge on it, but they're looking to get potash registered as a pesticide and approval for aquatic use, because currently, without it being approved, we would have to apply for emergency use, which is quite a process. And we would have to apply to the PMRA, or Pesticide Management Regulatory Agency, to be able to use that product. Again, a lot of it depends on, you know, the type of system that it's in. Is it in a closed water body? Is it in a flowing system? What's the connectivity like? You know, are we able to contain it as far as restricting access to watercraft users? So it's not a simple answer. And within our response plan, we have various levels of what we call incidents, I suppose, and the scale of the incident, and different options for responding depending on the level of the incident. But it's not a simple answer. It really kind of depends on where the introduction is. You know, when did you find it? Did you find it in October, or did you find it in May? Because, you know, in October, you're going into ice up, you have limited opportunities to get in there for control. But in May, they start to reproduce. So, you know, there's a lot of variables that need to be considered. But I think currently potash is considered kind of the most effective tool in a water body. There really aren't a lot of options, unfortunately.
All right. Can you provide contact information for people interested in attaching collection sites to their docks?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can either contact Lynn directly, and I don't know if you all have Lynn's contact, I'm assuming through the newsletter, or you can send me an email. And actually, I think, Lynn, would you be able to, it's on the last slide. I'm just trying to think of what would be the best way, or I can just say it. You can either email me at JERI, or put it in the chat. Charles, if you can put it in the chat as well, that might work.
I'll put it out in an alert.
Sure, yeah.
An email alert.
You can contact me by phone or by email to put in a request, and then we can sort of figure out the logistics of how to get samplers out to you. But yeah, the more support we can get with that citizen science program, just, you know, the more we get in the water, the more likely we're able to find something if there is something to be found. So that'd be great. So yeah, I will definitely get that information out through Lynn.
Okay. Brian, did you have another question?
I just had one more question, and I'm just kind of curious. You know, there's an obvious concern that eradication is a huge undertaking, depending on the size of the water body. And I'm just kind of curious, in a worst case scenario, is containment the only option? You know, when you say like, listen, we can't have no boats in or out. We've got, you know, the water has to stay in this lake. And what would happen in a worst case scenario if you can't eradicate them? I mean, does that lake just become sort of abandoned? You know, like.
No, then you have a Manitoba situation. So, you know, they attempted eradication in Lake Winnipeg. They used potash. They closed off the bay where zebra mussels were found, and they gave it a shot. And I think there were a few reasons why it didn't work. I can't speak to those. I wasn't part of the response, so I'm not actually sure on the details. But they did try it, and it didn't work. So the next step is to go towards containment. So our strategy, when I talk about our risk-based strategy, we're looking at preventing introduction, right? So for example, the placement of your watercraft inspection stations, for example, for us, they're as close to the borders as we can because we're trying to stop things from coming in. From a Manitoba perspective, they're looking at containment. So they're not, I mean, obviously they don't want additional introductions, but really they've had to, if you had to pick one place to focus your efforts, they're focusing on containment. So the location of their watercraft inspection stations are placed accordingly. So when I talk about, you know, strengthening our regulations, for example, Manitoba has what are called control zones. So, you know, they've assessed their, kind of looked at their watersheds, they've looked at watercraft movement, and they've implemented control zones. So if you're a watercraft that has, you know, say you're moving from point A to B and you're still within that particular control zone, so we'll call it the Nelson River control zone. As long as you're still within that control zone, you're fine to move around, because that means that anything in that watershed would naturally probably be affected anyway because of whether it be water flow or whatever. But as soon as you leave that control zone and you go to a new part of the province where you potentially could cause an introduction into an unaffected area within the province, you're now by law required to decontaminate. So you have to go to a watercraft decontamination station and make sure that you are decontaminated before you move on to any other part of the province. And so as part of the changes that were implemented last year within our Provincial Fisheries Act, one of the changes was to provide additional powers to the minister to be able to implement something like a control zone, so that we can then establish a particular location or zone where we're saying, okay, you know, we've tried eradication, we've tried containment, we're out of options for this particular area. This entire watershed or the downstream portion of the water, for example, is going to be affected no matter what, regardless of watercraft movement. This is now going to be a control zone. So as long as you stay within that control zone, you're fine, because you're really not causing any additional impacts. But as soon as you leave the control zone, you now are into additional regulatory controls, like making decontamination mandatory, for example. So with those changes that we made last year, we now have increased the ability for the minister to be able to very quickly implement those control zones. So that would be part of that response, is to say, okay, we have an introduction, we've tried this, it's not working, we need to do this stat, and the minister can basically go and say, okay, now this area, control zone, and implement conditions within that control zone. So there are some other options. You know, it's not, we're not just gonna close the lake and that's it. I mean, in Manitoba, they had, within the national park at Whirlpool Lake, they did do that. They shut it down completely. They restricted access. You couldn't even get in there with a canoe. And they went through a 3-year cycle, and in the end, that lake was believed to be a false positive. And they did reopen it because they never found any additional mussels or had any additional hits with their monitoring. So it was opened back up, but the national park, they just shut it right down.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jeri. That was an excellent presentation and some good questions. So that concludes our webinar for tonight. Don't forget to register. We have 2 more Lake Water Wednesdays coming up, and do take the survey at the end. And Lynn, I believe you have some closing remarks.
Yes, I just want to tell everyone here, um, you would no doubt, if you haven't worked up close with Jeri before, been very, very impressed, because I have been very impressed working alongside her in the task force that I sit on behalf of Parks. And you know, when Jeri was first hired, I thought, there's no way, we don't have enough staff, we don't have enough dollars. It's not going to be, and Jeri has the ability to get a billion people on her team. So if you will find out, for instance, that conservation officers have jobs that she gives them to do, that border officers are all trained by Jeri, and they very much expect that training and appreciate that training. When we sit in a very large group of organizations, you might have SaskPower talking about power that's generated from water and the prevention things they're doing, and everybody's reporting. It might be Parks reporting on educational programs they're conducting. And I'm just astounded how integrated this program is into the whole network of Saskatchewan. And that's the vision of this woman. And on your behalf, ladies and gentlemen, I thank her.
Thanks, Lynn. I appreciate that. We have really good partners. I will say coordination is a huge piece of the puzzle. And I think because everybody's operating under capacity, it serves us all, well to work together. And yeah, it's a lot of networking, but I enjoy it. So thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. I really enjoyed it.
Glad to have you.
All right, well, thanks again once again, everyone, and we'll see you next week for Lake Water Wednesdays.
Thank you.
Everybody, take care.